Live. Oh yeah, there it goes. Okay.
Welcome, Robert Whitaker, and welcome to all of you who are listening and watching. You're in for a real treat. Robert Whitaker, I want to make sure I get it all right, so I'm going to read a little, is an author, a journalist. He wrote two books. He wrote four books altogether, but two that happened to be about mental health and mental illness. The first was Mad in America, and the second, Anatomy of an Epidemic. Hopefully he'll tell us the subtitle. The part that's really important about that, among others, is that Bob won the Investigative Reporters Editors Book Award for the investigative journalism. He's also a science and medical reporter, and in fact is probably the only person that you'll hear from during this day who isn't one of the clinicians or workers in the field of mental health and mental illness. Rather, he is a researcher, an investigator, and a reporter about mental health and how a bit about the history and really where we are today in relation to all of this. So welcome, Bob. I'm so glad you're here.
It's nice to be here. So thank you for having me.
So a couple of questions we'll just start with. One I was delighted to read in your book, Anatomy of an Epidemic, and I bet people here would be interested in hearing your story. How is it that you came to be investigating the field of mental illness? Because often people come to the field, there's some family connection or some experience that they had, and your story is really different. So would you share that, please?
Yeah, I really came through this in a very backdoor manner. It goes back to 1998. I actually had left daily journalism at that time. I had my own publishing company that focused on the development of new drugs. But occasionally I still wrote for magazines and newspapers. And while I had that company, I came upon information, some documents and all, that really showed the abuse of psychiatric patients in research settings, and both in studies funded by pharmaceutical companies and studies funded by the National Institute of Mental Health. So I went to the Boston Globe, where I'd written on and off as a correspondent, and said, would you like a series on this? And they said yes. So I really was only going to write about that very specific topic, about abuse of psychiatric patients in research settings. But what happened, which was quite remarkable, what happened, which sort of transformed my life, basically, was this. While I was doing that series, I came upon two types of studies that really challenged what I knew to be true. One were studies done by the World Health Organization, which twice found that patients diagnosed with schizophrenia in the poor countries of the world, India, Colombia, and Nigeria, had much better outcomes than in the U.S. and the other countries, and other rich, developed countries. And of course, you wonder why that would be so. And the World Health Organization actually concluded this: living in a developed country is, quote, a strong predictor you won't have a good outcome. And I wondered, well, why would that be? Why would be living in a country with advanced medicine all be a predictor you'll have a poor outcome from a brain disease, quote, brain disease? And now when I did that series, my understanding was we were making great progress in treating serious mental disorders. My understanding was that schizophrenia was now known to be due to too much dopamine. We had drugs that fixed that chemical imbalance because they blocked dopamine. So I had a completely conventional understanding. And in fact, in that series, one of the things we wrote about was how awful it was that the NIMH had funded studies where they had withdrawn antipsychotics from patients. We said that's unethical. You would never withdraw insulin from a diabetic, so why would you withdraw an antipsychotic from a schizophrenia patient? But then I came upon these WHO studies, and I read them, and I was quite startled to find this. After the first one, they hypothesized maybe the reason for the better outcomes in the poor countries is that the patients there are more medication compliant. They take their antipsychotics more regularly, which is a valid hypothesis if the drugs are supposed to be so essential to a good outcome. So then in the second study, they measured medication usage of antipsychotics. And what did they find? They found, in fact, that in those poor countries that had very good outcomes, they used the drugs very, very differently. They used them acutely, but not chronically. They did not maintain people on them. And suddenly, I had this confusion. I understood that drugs were absolutely essential, fix the chemical imbalance, and now we had a World Health Organization study that said, well, outcomes are better in India and Nigeria where they don't keep most of their patients on the antipsychotics long term. So that confused me, and then I came upon a study done by Harvard researchers that charted longer-term schizophrenia outcomes over the past century, from 1900 forward. And they made two findings. One, that outcomes for schizophrenia patients were getting worse, and two, they were now no better than they had been in the first third of the 20th century. Now that belied the story of progress I believe in. So how did I come to this topic? I was curious about a medical failure, and one that went against what I knew to be true. And then I got a contract to write Mad in America, my first book, which really was to investigate, why do schizophrenia patients do so poorly in the United States? And so that was my beginning, curiosity. And after I wrote that book, and what happened there in that book, it became obvious to understand why they do so poorly today. You sort of had to understand the history of the treatment of the, quote, seriously mentally ill, and you can see how the past became precursor to the present, so to speak, certain attitudes and all. And then, to be honest with you, even after I finished that book, which was controversial, it was controversial enough, my agent said to me, go write something else. Get away from this topic. But eventually, I wrote 2 other books, but eventually people kept asking me, what's happening to kids in this country? Are they doing well once they're diagnosed and medicated? How about outcomes for people with depression? Where are all the bipolar patients coming from? And that's why I returned to the subject to write Anatomy of an Epidemic, there was basically these other unanswered questions that I thought needed answering. So yeah, I think I'm a rarity. I come at this really from curiosity, and then once I began writing about it, learning about it, I think it's such an important topic that it's worthwhile of staying with it.
From my perspective, that you are a champion. In that you don't have any skin in the game, you don't have an axe to grind, you don't have anger, something to prove about something that happened to you or a family member or a child. You really are a neutral journalist who's curious to find out. And with that, I would imagine, I would hope that what you discover and discovered would be accepted more readily. That people would say, isn't this interesting, and maybe we need to reconsider. Has that been your experience?
That's a great question. So, as you can imagine, I begin by investigating a failure. Why do schizophrenia patients do so poorly, right? Well, what you find when you really begin tracking the science, and really the science of those who've been telling us a certain story. I'm talking about mainstream psychiatry. They've been telling us this story about the medical model and all they've learned about mental disorders and these fake drugs. You find that it doesn't hold up. It just does, their own science does not support the story they're telling to the public. And so now think of me. I come to them, and actually what I do in both books, in the second half of Mad American and all of Anatomy, I'm not saying here's what the critics are saying about you. I'm saying, have you looked at your own research? What does it really say? Does it support the story you're telling? No. That's number one. And what about the long-term effects of your drugs? Are they really helping people thrive? Are they helping people function better? Are they even reducing symptoms over the long term? And and I'm not looking at the critic, some sort of alternative type of research. I'm saying, what did your own NIMH-funded studies show? And they show, in fact, that the medications not only aren't improving long-term outcomes, it's pretty clear they're actually increasing the chronicity of these disorders. They're inducing more functional disability. So imagine I'm a journalist. I say, here's your research. Add it all up into a narrative story, and what you're really seeing is a failed paradigm of care. And then, having done that, in the book I say, well, why don't they recognize it? And then we get into the world of commerce and guild interests. So what do most people within mainstream psychiatry, or at least many, when they get this book, they're very angry because it's threatening to everything. It's threatening to guild interests. It's threatening to the way we do things. It's threatening to the paradigm of care we have. And ultimately, I think it's, it's threatening to the very story they've organized their life around, and that's really tough to change.
My own personal reaction to reading both of the books, and I still I felt compelled. Certainly, Man in America was the first one because of when I started my professional career as a psychiatric nurse, working in the second oldest psychiatric hospital in the country in Providence, Rhode Island, and watching what was happening there. And I was lucky enough to work in the day hospital, but I was the medication nurse, and so I was rolling out medications, and I could see there was one fellow in particular. He's a young man. I'm not sure he was 30. He had such a severe case of tardive dyskinesia. And of course, that was the person with whom I learned about tardive dyskinesia, watching him. And of course, the conundrum is you could eliminate the symptoms by increasing the psychotropic med, which would only, of course, make the symptoms ultimately worse. Right. And when I think back on that, I can easily go to a place of great despair and sadness because that was, 30 plus years ago, and I wonder about that man's life. His father happened to be a physician, not a psychiatrist, but a physician, and I know that father was doing what he believed to be the best thing for his son. Sure. And then I just think, what a tragedy. So as I read that book, and now as I'm reading more of Anatomy in preparation of talking with you, I got to tell you, I skipped to the end because I couldn't get sadder. I needed to get to the place of hope. And with that, I don't want to discount. I don't want to lose the thread of your incredibly vital and important work that is unbelievably threatening to those who have a certain picture in their head of what is important and what makes sense, and that we have broken brains and we're creating drugs that are supposed to cure the broken brain, and then P.S. the brain's not cured enough. We got to get another drug to help with the efficacy of the first drug that's going to fix your broken brain. But with that, let me ask, do you have in your own head a picture or a definition of what is mental health?
Yeah, what is mental health? It's certainly not the absence of suffering. It's certainly not the absence of unpleasant emotions. I mean, that's to be human is to have unpleasant thoughts. To be human is to struggle with your mind. And that doesn't mean we're constantly in struggle, but it's a rare person who doesn't have feelings, emotions, thoughts that are distressing to him or her at some time. And especially, if you're engaged in life, you love people, and you're taking risks, there's going to be really hard moments and really difficult moments. And, we're made to feel. So we're made to feel. We're not some steady state emotional machine where you go along like this. So what is mental health? I think mental health is, I think it begins to arise with that understanding, actually, is that we human beings are supposed to, life's difficult. And, you're not supposed to be happy all the time, but if happiness visits now and then, you're a lucky person. And then I think really is this, if you can look around your life and say, okay, I have a job that provides some meaning, whatever it might be, and people find meaning in all sorts of ways, or a role in life, it can be as a volunteer, whatever, but you have some sort of position in society that you find meaningful. And, people can find meaningful in 1,000 different ways, but some sort of sense that they do occupy a meaningful place. And if you can look around and say, I have friends, or I have people who love me, that's a good self-reflection. And then, if you can look around and sort of at least have the sense of, okay, what do I need to do to, try to keep physically healthy, that sort of thing, if I am, whether it be exercise or diet or that sort of thing. So I guess what I say is, what is mental health? I think it's just an understanding that, your mind is a difficult place so often, but that we can do things, strive for things that help us, like, to be more comfortable within ourselves. I do think they come from things like meaning in life, whether you're being loved, family, that sort of thing. So I think mental health is as much as anything a perspective on being alive, that is how complicated it is, and feeling okay with that, I guess, or feeling that even if the suffering, even if you're like really in a difficult period, having some faith in human resilience at the same time.
And how about happiness? How do you see that fitting in?
Well, listen, you can't chase happiness. That's a futile pursuit. Happiness visits you while you're engaged in other pursuits. You can't just be happy. You certainly can't chase it. But the moment might be like you're at a dinner party and you go like, I really like these people. This is so fun. Or maybe you have this moment when you're with your child and you say, I love this person so much. I'm so blessed to have this, this amazing child. Or maybe it's a moment when, I don't know, you are seeing something incredibly beautiful, a landscape, something like that. But the biggest thing is happiness occurs while we're doing other things. And while that's happening, you'll feel this flood and you'll feel this gratitude, like, wow, this is a great moment in life.
Yeah. The piece that certainly we've been talking about on our site, Mental Health and Happiness, but we alone are not talking about it. But don't miss it. Because it is something that happens while you're doing other things, and you may be so engaged in the other thing that you miss the moment of, oh, I felt happy. So paying attention to, yeah, this is a good one, I'm feeling happy. Cool. Let me ask you slightly different than anticipated, but I know that in your research to find out more about other places in the world, really following up on the research of the World Health Organization that said people who were having diagnosable mental illnesses in other parts of the world were actually doing better. Would you say that mental health and mental illness is understood differently in different cultures and different parts of the world?
Well, historically, definitely. I mean, historically, you can find all sorts of different cultural explanations for psychosis, mania, severe depression, that sort of thing. That's changing, though. I mean, the American Psychiatric Association has been exporting the DSM model really around the world, and with somewhat great success. And you can see the mechanism of exporting that value. If you go to an annual meeting of the American Psychiatric Association, about half the psychiatrists there are from outside the United States. Most of them, at least traditionally, have been there on grants from pharmaceutical companies. And they come here and they hear the American psychiatrists that are very prestigious universities talking about biological problems and that biological framework. And so often they take it back home and they eventually begin to change their cultures too. But just to give an example of one of the many different types of cultural attitudes you hear. I spent some time in the upper Amazon after Mad in America. And I was with some indigenous groups there, and one indigenous group. And this was actually an indigenous group that is still pretty, not very much they have their own, they're still hunting with blowguns, that sort of thing. They practice shaman medicine, etc. But they don't even have a concept of that the person is mentally ill. What they have is the idea that a person can sort of become, that ancestors can visit someone, okay? And when they visit someone, it's actually a message to the whole tribe. It's not just to that person. And maybe that person's visions or suffering or whatever is a way for the tribe to know that the ancestors are unhappy, or they're trying to communicate. So they have rituals that try to really to communicate with their ancestors that involve not just that one person, but of course a larger community. So the point is, there they don't have a conception of the individual suffering from a mental illness. What they have is a concept that disturbing things in your mind can be a sign of basically the ancestors, but it's a message, and then they have tribal rituals for responding to that community crisis. So that's a very different vision of what it means to be human, too, because they see themselves not in this Western I sense, but really more in a communal sense, almost like a beehive type sense.
Mm.
Well, that's very different. So, I mean, that's just one example, and obviously that is coming out of a very different philosophy of being. It's animism, I think they call it, where, ancestors live in trees and everything has a spirit. But yeah, I think we tend to think that, mental illness, we discovered something true in science, that it's biological. And what I think the studies of mental illness around the world tell us that they're so culturally bound, including in the United States and Western medicine. And in fact, science hasn't shown us an illness that is separate from the cultural context.
Well, with that, let me ask you to share a little bit about what you discovered in Finland when they actually were able to. Their treatment was so different, and it really was a family. Can you share some of that with everybody as well?
Sure. So in this book, Anatomy of an Epidemic, towards the end, I wanted to go, okay, well, where are they doing things differently and getting very good outcomes? And if you look at that for psychotic patients, especially if you look at a community that is charting how their first episode psychotic patients do over the long term, well, that brings you to northern Finland, in western Lapland, and to a town called Tornio. And going back really more than 20 years, they adopted a new model of care. They broke with Western medicine that was saying schizophrenia is a brain disease, etc. And they said this: schizophrenia does not happen in the brain of an individual. Psychosis happens in the in-between spaces of people. There's a disruption in that in-between space. And the person who is, quote, psychotic is bearing the burden of making known this disruption in the social space, right? So what they have a way is treating that social space rather than the individual. And it's called open dialogue therapy. And as much as anything, it's based around, it does come out of family therapy, okay? And the point is, we exist in networks, including the family being one of the key ones. And one of the times you see people really becoming distressed is when they become isolated from that network. They can't function with it in some ways, and they feel maybe they feel kicked out, or it's just not a comforting place for them. So one of the first things they do is in this part of Finland is try to treat that network, that community. So they'll bring everybody into a meeting, not just the person, and they'll start asking everybody their story in a narrative sense. And then you'll start seeing what happened. There are people talking about their own relationships to each other. And as much as anything, they're trying to see where that group narrative is clashing, so to speak. Why is it producing certain emotional turmoil, dysfunction, unpleasant feelings, stress? And through this narrative, help resolve those problems and also get the person who's struggling so much an image of a narrative or an image of the self going forward they can now reintegrate into society. So it's about building a narrative not of failure or being isolated, but building a narrative, in fact, of where I can be with you and I can think about going back to work or to school. So it's a totally different conception of what, quote, madness is. And because of this conception, they use antipsychotics very sparingly. So 5 years after initial diagnosis, only 1/3 of their first episode psychotic patients have ever been exposed to antipsychotic drugs. So they don't have all these problems that come with the drugs. They don't have the risk of PD, feeling emotionally disengaged, metabolic dysfunction. So think about that. It's a form of care that is really helping people get their lives back in a robust way. And it shows us what's possible if we would just rethink this whole paradigm of care.
My mind is, of course, spinning with all of that. One is, what's the cost? And Finland has a very different way of handling the cost of healthcare altogether, don't they?
Sure, they have very much a nationalized health service program. By the way, it hasn't been adopted in the rest of Finland. It's just this corner of Finland, and that's its own story. I actually was in Finland about earlier this week. The cost is this. It's a little more for the first year because they throw a lot of resources to crisis, etc. But long term, it leads to a lot of savings.
Right.
And what learns the savings is people don't remain patients.
Right.
So 80% of their people at the end of 5 years are working or back in school. They're just not mental patients anymore. Whereas if you were to track 100 people who had a psychotic episode in the United States, got the medications, told they were a chronic brain disease, 5 years, you see a high percentage now, in fact, on disability, not working. So which is more expensive? Put some money up front and get people back to work, or maintain them for 40 years as chronic patients?
Yeah.
It's a classic thing. Spend more now and save a lot later.
Right. And do you have any other idea why the rest of Finland has not adopted? They haven't said, oh, this is a great idea, let us do it too?
That is a great question. And when I was asking some Finnish journalists on Monday of this week, 3 days ago,
yeah.
Here's what they say, is that much of Finland got bought. Much of Finnish psychiatry got bought in the same way that American psychiatry got bought by the pharmaceutical industry. So as pharmaceutical companies began promoting, the disease model post DSM-3, in the same way they hired people in the United States, famous psychiatrists, to be speakers, advisors, and consultants, they did the same in Finland. So they go into the universities, they find some of the most prominent psychiatrists, and they begin paying them to be speakers, advisors, consultants. And once you do that, especially if you manage to recruit powerful people, the rest of the profession tends to tag along, and that's what's happened in Finland. And the irony is this: whereas you have this one part, this one corner of Finland, and by the way, they've reported their findings in numerous research journals. It's not just anecdotal. Doing so well, outcomes for schizophrenia patients in the rest of Finland are terrible. They might even be worse than in the United States. So it is a real interesting story about how a form of care that challenges conventional wisdom, even in its own backyard, it's not going to be so easy to promote. And challenges commercial interest. That's not so good either.
Right. That's certainly here in, my politics might be showing. But in the United States, that's, not going to work. Well, the other thing that I think about, it's just, tragic and at the same time hopeful. So one of the things that's happening that happened there, as you said, the individual had the problem, and instead of being isolated or being seen as the one that was in trouble, this therapy surrounds this person, not only with the professionals who facilitate, but they're surrounded by their community, their family, their friends. And part of what I see happening, it's never been great in the United States. But now, with our using the term mental health, when in fact we don't mean mental health, we mean mental illness or an emotional crisis, right. More and more that person gets more and more and more and more isolated. And if what you said the natives found in the I can't remember the area that you were in, but and also in Finland, and it's certainly what Glasser was talking about. The crisis is a crisis of relationship, and we need not to isolate them more. We need to help them figure out how to stay connected. I think this is on, but your thoughts about that?
No, I think this is fundamental, and it goes a bit back to starting with what are human beings? I mean, who are we? What do we make up? And one of the most amazing things about our paradigm of care, it pretends that environment doesn't count.
Right.
In other words, what's been happening to you doesn't count. You were traumatized, a month ago. Well, that's too bad. But are you sleeping? Would you have this symptom and that sort of thing? Or when you were a kid? And I think fundamentally, human beings are really communal creatures by and large. I mean, we do need relationships. Excuse me. It's really hard to keep yourself well if you become too isolated. We're just not made to be isolated. So given that fact, the fact that we do have a form of care that just increases the isolation, why should we expect it to work? And it increases the isolation in so many ways. I mean, the drugs themselves are isolating because they can sort of prevent you from really mounting an emotional response. Sometimes, tragically, they make you look less than fully engaged. And you know, with the metabolic things, often that you end up with a shape that's not, you know, doesn't, you know, it's hard for people to have. And then the next thing you know, they do get sort of, you know, isolated in these ghettos, so to speak, you know, group homes and not out in sort of a general mix. Why would you think that would work? I mean, the point is, and I really do believe this. For anatomy, for example, I probably collected the life stories of 70 to 80 people. Virtually everyone had a story of isolation or disruptions in friendships or family. They were all about, in essence, disruptions in the social space. And when you talk about people who are doing better, they found ways to repair that. So I think classes, you know, the idea that relations are the heart of mental health, and that without them it's difficult to be healthy, I agree. Loneliness is tough.
Yeah. Yeah. One of the things that I've been thinking a lot about lately are the children who are in schools, and I know you've spent time looking at that as well. But usually, in almost any elementary school you go in, most kids from third graders up and adults can identify the kid who's having difficulties in school. The kindergartners can too, if that child happens to be in the kindergartner's class. But kindergartners don't necessarily see the bigger school. And actually, most schools do a pretty good job of surrounding that one child with a cadre of services. Now, what they do, that's a whole other question. But they do a pretty good job of surrounding that kid. What they don't do a good job of, at least that I'm aware of, and I'm hoping people will write in and tell me that I'm wrong, and that is to go into the class to say where this kid is. Our job is to be in relation with this disturbed child, and how are we going to, we're in a community here together, and we're all in it together. And so that it's not isolated, that's the weird kid. No, this is our classmate. He's having difficulty in this area, and you're having difficulty spelling, and somebody else is having difficulty because their grandmother died or whatever. But it's part of we are all in it together, rather than that child being isolated and then gets more and more isolated. So that child who actually did the shooting in Newtown, that child was an unhappy child for all of his life, and I'm sure he was totally isolated, and his mother was too. But anyway.
Can I say one thing about that?
Yeah, please say lots of things.
I think this is really important. I was talking to a person who's studies classrooms and whether they work or not, and he talked about one of the places you see a lot of the support you're talking about that comes from kids themselves. Right. Is you have a classroom that actually spans 3 years of age, and what happens, he says in there, is he says when you get everybody within a 12-month thing, you get a lot of alpha behavior and sort of a pecking order set up because they see themselves as in competition. But when you have a 3-year age group, the youngest kids do not see themselves in competition with the older kids. And he says what you'll see is the older kids now, in fact, will start mentoring the younger kids so often, and really without much encouragement. It just starts to happen. Yeah. That becomes the environment of the classroom. And then what he said is so great is that young kid moves through the same classroom through 3 years, and now ends up the oldest kid in the class. Now they're mentoring to the younger kids. And my point is, the way you described it, I think, is right. How do we help the individual who's maybe the kid who's struggling or whatever? And that type of classroom, it seems like, is much more successful at nurturing the kid who's traveling, as opposed to the one where everybody's the same year and there's so much competition to be the big man on campus, so to speak. So my point is, I agree with you. You know, how do we build a space around the kid that's having so much difficulty? And as you know, often that kid is having trouble at home too. It's not just in the classroom.
Right.
And
And often the parents are too.
yeah, the parents are too. And then maybe what we really need to think about is, well, how do you build nurturing classrooms?
Yeah.
And maybe it's very different.
Yeah. And again, that's Glasser's work in quality schools, among other things. But yes, that's the idea. Interesting. The other piece I was thinking about in relation to that you were talking about earlier, back in my day, nobody was ever diagnosed bipolar. They had to, unless they were 18 years or older. But what I saw happen, and I'll be the first to admit, I did no research. It's totally anecdotal. At the same time, I was there when it was happening. Since lithium carbonate seemed to be working for people who were bipolar, let's give it to somebody who had a psychotic episode. And let's do it to prevent another psychotic episode from ever happening. Now, it worked for some, and it didn't work for others. But, of course, I thought to myself, it's like that joke, why are you clapping? To keep the elephants away. Well, maybe if you didn't clap, the elephants would stay away anyway. I mean, the same thing with the lithium. And now, there was a fellow actually out here in Denver who did a powerful series that got the attention of many about the children who were being medicated so heavily are foster children. And they're diagnosing children as young as 4 years old with lithium carbonate. So what you talk about is the medication, the chronic medication is setting people up for a lifetime of disability, and it's starting at younger and younger ages. Thoughts, comments, additions?
Now you're going to get me depressed. This is medicine gone so horribly awry. They're ruining those kids' lives. Let's just be honest. You diagnose a kid at age 4 with bipolar, or whatever you want to call it, bipolar, and you put them on psychiatric medications, whether it be lithium or an antipsychotic, you're ruining that kid's life. You're making a decision where you're sending that kid down a different path in life, and it's not a good path. And it's a path that will be filled with physical problems, some cognitive decline because of the drugs, emotional disengagement. They're just not going to have near the life that could have been possible. They're going to die early. And, that child was born and, in a religious sense, had a God-given right to see what they could make of themselves. That's what we humans do. We grow up and we learn about our mind, and then we try to make something of ourselves. And, we get to experience the world. We get to experience feelings, the whole gamut of things. We're taking that from that kid when you diagnose him with bipolar and put him on a drug. And here's the thing. All the research shows it's bad for the kid. There's no research that shows that's going to help that kid grow up and thrive. You're going to create a chronic mental patient. And by the way, I know a number of foster care kids that were treated this way. Now, many of them are ruined. What can I tell you? But there's a few that have escaped, which does speak to the resilience of the human being. And man, are they bitter. Like that they had their childhood taken away from them. Why? Why was that done to them? You can't give a good reason. I mean, you can give a monetary reason, but that's not a good reason. And it's just that this is one of the worst things our country's ever done.
Yeah.
Diagnosed 4-year-olds with bipolar and put them on antipsychotics. It's a crime, is what it is.
So what about? And again, maybe I'm asking a question that's not a fair one to ask you, but insurance companies are so worried about doing. Giving money to insure treatment that doesn't have scientific outcomes-based, evidence-based practice, and these don't, and that does seem to keep the insurance companies from doing any way prevent spending money on that. Do you have any understanding of that? I didn't ask that question really clearly, but
you're asking, not really. What happens is this: is they will do these really ridiculous studies that are so value-laden. So they'll take a kid who's 4 years old, okay, and they'll say, if we give him Risperdal, do they do they get a little less aggressive, at least for 6 weeks? They're not asking what's happening to the kid, but is he less aggressive? That becomes an effective treatment if there's just a little less aggressive. And it's only 6 weeks. We're not even looking at all these other domains, right?
Yeah.
And what happens is insurance companies are sort of trained and conditioned to pay for whatever is approved by the FDA. And actually, even if it's not approved, sometimes to pay for what the doctors, psychiatrists say you should have, that this is real treatment. So what happens is the insurance companies, I don't think, have the capacity to really understand what's going on. They don't have the built-in functioning to say, is this good? What's happening long-term? Just sort of following common wisdom. They don't want to fight this battle. But, I've been asked sometimes to give talks to pharmacy benefit managers, and they don't really believe it, that it's good. It's more like in the larger context of things, they know this is the expectation, and they don't want to fight the battle.
Oh.
There was even a group that served as, this goes back a ways. Sometimes these pharmacy benefit managers will actually hire like independent teams of researchers to investigate something. And a group, I think it was in Pennsylvania, did just that. And I forget which HMO it was. And basically the consultants came back as none of these drugs are recommended for kids diagnosed with juvenile bipolar disorder. Evidence of even their short-term efficacy on any meaningful domain is very scant. And there's all these sort of huge problems. I doubt it didn't change anything. So I don't know. I mean, what this tells you is that when we hear that psychiatry is evidence-based, it's just not so. If they want to do something, there's ways to create an evidence for doing it. And the juvenile bipolar story is that. I mean, who says a little bit decrease in aggression for 6 weeks is also great? Yeah. When you have all those other problems, that's not a disease question. That's a cultural question.
Okay, so here's the thing. We don't have a whole lot of time left, so I'm thinking maybe we could make a choice to shift the conversation slightly. A couple of things I want to ask. One is, what have you learned that gives you hope, that gives you a feeling of, I can see, I don't know, a light at the end of the tunnel, perhaps. Okay. Well, let me just leave that. Let's start there. Ask you to give us your hopeful thoughts.
I think my hopeful thought is this. We've really been 35 years down this particular path where we said we're going to call emotional distress or whatever diseases of the brain ever since the APA published a third edition of its Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. Listen, the signs of a failed paradigm of care are everywhere you look. And it's being increasingly hard for psychiatry to deny that. So, and I think more and more people in the population are wondering, like, what happened? I mean, how did we become so psychiatrized, so to speak? So my reason for hope is, paradigms do shift. And I think that after 35 years, we're seeing the consequences of a broken paradigm. And then B is this. If we can look forward to building a new paradigm, creating a new paradigm, and creating new thinking, you have this fountain of human resilience that is always ready to appear. So it's like this untapped treasure trove. So if we just find ways to nurture the resilience and say, let's make that human capacity at the core of whatever we do when we think about how to create better schools or help kids in college or help that depressed person. I mean, humans are resilient. They are really resilient if they can just be reminded of this. So that's an optimistic thing.
Absolutely. I feel better already, honest to goodness. One of the things that Dr. Glasser used to say is that the DSM is a manual of unhappy people. And it's also a manual describing unhappy people. He also said it's a description of how creative we are. All the various and sundry ways people can express their creativity. and that we've got it in the DSM. Now, I think one of the good things about the most recent DSM, everybody knows that they went too far. Even they know they went too far. And so that hopefully might be the beginning of the paradigm or the swing, the shift, switching. And at the same time, if you can think about that same creativity as you have just shared, with instead of the dark side, let's look at the opposite side, the resilience, incredible creativity about all sorts of things, including the issue of mental health. And certainly that's what we're trying to do here at Mental Health and Happiness, is to say, let's think about it differently. Let's think about where you are in the continuum. And you can, even if you are that foster kid, do something to move slightly higher on the continuum, so you're feeling mentally healthier and happier.
Yeah.
Well, that's very helpful. Thanks. You were going to say, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, I just think, and then going back to the DSM is a bad novel, so to speak. It's like just a really bad novel written by unimaginative people who have no sense of philosophy of life. And I think we're understanding that, and I think the part of the swing back will. I mean, think about this. You have the DSM, and then you have a history of literature. The human being described in the DSM is completely at odds with what literature tells us about people. And hopefully we can regain a consciousness, a philosophy of being in our society that's much more consonant, resonant with an understanding of literature, Shakespeare, that sort of thing.
Okay, so a couple of last questions. One is, if people want to know more about you, learn more about you, know how to get your books, that kind of thing, tell us how we can connect with you.
Well, the easiest way is I run a website for discussing a lot of these issues, a forum for it. It's called madinamerica.com. So you can go there, and it's really, if you go to the contact, you can just send me an email. So my name will pop up, and you can just, and I'm really good about getting back to people. So that's the easiest way. Just go to madinamerica.com. You can find my email there and send me an email, and I'll get back to you.
Awesome. I didn't know that, so I now maybe you may find my name as a participant. And I guess the last thing I want to ask is, what's the thought, idea that you would like to leave our audience with when they think about you? What are you hoping that they'll remember and walk away with?
Thinking about me? Well, I don't know. That's a funny question, because it almost sounds grandiose to have anyone think that they'll...
Well, you are a contributor, major contributor to the conversation.
I think that I would hope they think I played a role of some small part anyway in helping us think of why we as a society really need to reject the current system. It is doing so much harm. And as we think about what we might do differently, maybe a little bit to think about how great human beings are.
Yeah.
And then that's something to draw on as we try to build a better society that's better at nurturing people. So just to have this sense of good feelings toward us, so to speak. We're pretty amazing sometimes. I'm talking about human beings.
Yes. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts, your ideas, and all that you've learned with us here, and being part of this very important day. I do want to remind people that the World Health Organization is the organization that declared October 10th World Mental Health Day. This year they're talking about schizophrenia, and I hope, with fingers crossed, that they might also be sharing the research that you've shared about some places where work is being done differently with greater success in helping people who have that diagnosis. So, thanks very much, Bob.
Yeah, thanks very much for having me on. I appreciate it.